March 15, 1943, 03 a.m. The cold sea air cuts through the Allied convoy as it sails towards the treacherous waters near the North Atlantic. The low hum of engines fills the air, blending with the unsettling sound of waves crashing against the hull. Suddenly, an alert blares through the ship's speakers, the panic in the voice of the operator unmistakable. "Submarine detected, heading straight for us." Within seconds, the crew rushes into action, their movements swift, trained, and desperate. In the heart of this chaos, a lone figure stands at the back of the ship's engine room, a mechanic named Peter Thomason. Just a simple mechanic from a small factory in Michigan, Peter is about to face a situation that will defy all expectations of what an ordinary man can do in the heat of battle. Peter's hands, calloused from years of turning wrenches, grip a small, rusty bolt. This simple piece of metal, a mere tool, will become the key to saving hundreds of lives. The sub's sonar ping grows louder, signaling its approach. The tension is palpable. In a moment of sheer inspiration, Peter realizes what he must do. He doesn't think twice. Without hesitation, Peter races to the engine room's control panel, his fingers flying across the switches. A crew member stationed nearby watches him in confusion. "What are you doing, Thomason? We need that sonar disabled now." But Peter has another idea in mind, something far more inventive. A quick turn of the wrench, a twist of the bolt, and the ship's navigation system is patched in a way no one else thought possible. The ship's sonar is now connected to the communication system through a clever modification of the engine's main control, using a system that no one had considered. The bolt acts as a makeshift trigger, rerouting the sonar's power supply just enough to divert it to the signal jamming unit, making the submarine's detection system go haywire. It's a gamble, but it's all Peter can think of in that moment. As the crew scrambles to fire at the incoming submarine, Peter watches the screen, beads of sweat trickling down his forehead. The submarine's position shifts erratically on the radar, caught in the interference. It takes a few precious moments, but when the first depth charge is launched, it's directly on target. A massive explosion reverberates through the hull, and the enemy submarine is destroyed. But Peter's work is far from over. The sound of gunfire erupts from the deck. Enemy soldiers, hidden in the depths of the water, are coming up from underwater caves to launch a final assault. Peter's mind races. Using the same simple tools, he begins to modify a set of old anti-torpedo mechanisms, adjusting their firing mechanisms. He knows the exact specifications, the bolt's threaded design, which can withstand the extreme pressure and stress of underwater warfare. He modifies it into a trigger that fires torpedoes in rapid succession, sending them on a predetermined path towards the remaining submarines. By the time the last torpedo is fired, 47 enemy submarines have been obliterated in a brutal hour. The sea is silent except for the splashing of waves. But Peter's ordeal isn't over yet. He hears the sounds of footsteps on the steel deck behind him, soldiers closing in on the ship. Without hesitation, he grabs the nearest wrench and uses it to lock the ship's weapons compartment shut, buying enough time for the crew to regroup. Born in a small town in Michigan, Peter Thomason was an ordinary man. He wasn't a scientist, a soldier, or a strategist, just a mechanic with a knack for fixing things. At 28, he had worked at a local factory since he was 16, repairing machines and tools no one else dared to touch. His reputation for finding simple solutions to complex problems made him an invaluable asset to the company. It wasn't long before Peter's skills caught the attention of the military. In 1941, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Peter was recruited to assist in maintaining the equipment for the U.S. Navy. His life, once confined to the humdrum of factory life, was suddenly thrust into the chaos of wartime innovation. Peter wasn't a fan of the limelight. He didn't care about awards or recognition. He just wanted to fix things and ensure his fellow soldiers came home safely. He lived in constant fear that the next day would be his last, but he had a deep understanding of mechanical systems that made him the ideal candidate for the job. Peter's journey to the front lines started on a cold morning in March of 1943. Assigned to a naval ship patrolling the Atlantic, he was part of a larger convoy that was tasked with delivering essential supplies to Allied forces across Europe. What started as a routine assignment quickly turned into a race against time. Peter knew that his contribution would likely be overlooked. After all, he wasn't the one firing the guns or commanding the ship. But he also knew that without the proper maintenance, the ship wouldn't have been able to function in the first place. He didn't realize it then, but the next few days would put him to the ultimate test, one that would define his legacy. The night was frigid, and the sea winds howled as the convoy's flagship, an old, sturdy naval vessel, plowed through the dark waters of the North Atlantic. Peter stood in the engine room, surrounded by the rhythmic hum of machinery. The cold air that filtered through the vents barely helped the heat from the engines, and sweat beaded on his brow. His hands, steady as always, moved across the ship's inner workings, checking the connections, oil levels, and fuel lines. Suddenly, an urgent call came through the intercom. "All hands! Battle stations! Enemy submarines approaching!" The quiet hum of the engines shifted, becoming a cacophony of warning sirens, clanging metal, and frantic shouting. Peter didn't flinch. He had worked through more crises than he cared to count, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just a simple mechanical failure. It was an attack, a real threat that could tear the convoy apart. The crew had trained for this moment, but no amount of preparation could have predicted what was coming. On the radar screen, blips began appearing in clusters, their movement too erratic to be anything but submarines. As the enemy vessels closed in, the convoy's captain gave the order to fire. Peter's heart skipped a beat. The ship was moving too slowly, and the torpedo defense systems weren't ready. The problem, Peter realized, wasn't just the immediate threat of attack. It was a much deeper issue that threatened the convoy's ability to respond at all. The submarine's stealthy approach and the ship's unpreparedness would soon spell disaster. Worse still, the ship's sonar system was malfunctioning. It hadn't been calibrated properly, and the submarine's stealthy sonar evaded detection. Without accurate readings, they were flying blind. Peter knew that the regular method of dealing with underwater threats wasn't going to cut it. The submarine's advanced stealth technology and the ship's reliance on outdated systems put them in an untenable situation. The torpedoes were useless without precise targeting. The ship had no chance against the powerful enemy submarines lurking just out of reach. The deeper issue was mechanical. The ship's sonar system and communication network were outdated and poorly maintained, leaving them vulnerable. The controls had not been calibrated correctly in months, and the backup systems were barely functional. A simple bolt or mechanical adjustment could make the difference between life and death. But the problem wasn't just fixing a broken part. It was about how to make that small adjustment count when lives hung in the balance. With only minutes to react, Peter's mind raced through possible solutions. He needed to act fast. With no time to go through the standard procedures, Peter improvised. He needed to get the sonar back online and recalibrate it on the fly, using whatever was available. He scanned the control room, his eyes landing on the tools within arm's reach. As the first wave of enemy torpedoes headed for the ship, Peter grabbed a wrench and moved towards the main control panel. He noticed a loose connection, a misaligned cable that, if fixed, could recalibrate the sonar just enough to give them a fighting chance. But it wasn't a simple fix. It wasn't even a standard procedure. It required altering the equipment in ways no one had ever considered. Peter bent over the panel, his mind working at full speed. The time was now. If he could fix the sonar, he could buy the crew enough time to make a defensive strike. But he also knew this could go wrong in ways no one could predict. It wasn't just about being quick. It was about being precise. With shaking hands, Peter began connecting wires, rerouting circuits, and using a mix of mechanical skill and intuition to perform a makeshift repair. The bolts that held everything together were loose from years of neglect. As he worked, the ship's engines groaned, rattling from the stress. The sound of approaching torpedoes echoed in his mind like a countdown to certain destruction. It was during the tense moments before the first torpedo hit that Peter discovered his solution. Amid the chaos, he noticed something odd about the way the wiring inside the sonar system was configured. For months, the crew had been struggling to make sense of the sonar system's failure, but Peter's mechanical mind was able to see the issue clearly. A single, seemingly insignificant bolt, a rusted piece of metal that had long been overlooked, had caused the misalignment. The vibrations of the ship during the harsh Atlantic journey had caused it to loosen, resulting in the malfunction. Peter's eyes widened as he understood. It wasn't a high-tech solution or a complex overhaul. It was simple mechanical ingenuity. If he could just use this bolt, properly reattached to the main control panel, he could make the sonar work once again. With no time to lose, Peter grabbed a wrench from his toolkit and started tightening the bolt. The engine's rumbling grew louder, drowning out everything else. Sweat dripped from his brow as he tightened the final turn, not knowing if it would work. But as the bolt clicked into place, the sonar suddenly came to life, blinking green lights across the control panel. Peter held his breath, praying the makeshift repair would hold. The crew had no idea what was happening below decks, but they could hear the familiar sound of the radar system recalibrating. Outside, the enemy subs closed in. The crew fired blindly in the general direction, but their shots were off target. Peter knew it was only a matter of time before they would need another chance. The bolts he had worked with so tirelessly, the wires he had adjusted, might just be enough to make that one last adjustment, the one that could turn the tide. The moment Peter had waited for came faster than he expected. The first depth charge was fired, and the blast echoed across the water, rattling the hull of the ship. The shock wave sent tremors through Peter's body as he stood in the control room, staring at the sonar screen. A faint blip appeared on the radar, closer than before. The bolts and wires he had adjusted were working. For the first time since the attack began, the crew could see the enemy's movements on the screen with precision. The ship had a fighting chance. Peter wiped the sweat from his forehead, still unsure if the fix would hold. The ship's systems were far from perfect, and there was still a long way to go before they could eliminate the threat. But for the first time, the crew was able to target the incoming submarine. Peter's hands shook as he pressed the button to transmit the coordinates. The ship fired another torpedo, this time with pinpoint accuracy. The torpedo hit its mark. The submarine's hull erupted in a massive explosion. Water surged around the ship as the force of the blast rocked the vessel. The crew cheered, their spirits lifted, but Peter didn't allow himself the luxury of relief. They had won one battle, but the war was far from over. Peter rushed back to the main control panel, his mind already working on the next move. The submarine had been taken out, but there were still more to come. The ship needed more time, more power, to keep up with the relentless assault. The bolts that had made the sonar functional were still holding, but the pressure was mounting. Every minute counted. If Peter could adjust the weapon system just enough, they might stand a chance. Outside, the sky was lit with flashes of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning fuel. The battle was intensifying, but Peter could only focus on the mechanical systems that stood between him and the enemy. He wasn't a strategist, but his understanding of the ship's inner workings could make the difference. A second torpedo was launched. This time, it was aimed at one of the remaining submarines. The crew waited, hearts pounding as the missile cut through the water. The explosion was deafening. The submarine was destroyed. Peter's heart raced, but there was no time for celebration. The bolts and adjustments he had made were holding strong, but there was no guarantee they would last. The ship's systems were constantly under stress, and the next attack could break them all. Peter grabbed another wrench and made another adjustment to the weapon system. The gears inside the control panel were grinding, but with each turn of the wrench, Peter felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't out of danger yet, but they were no longer flying blind. With one last push, the ship fired again, and the third submarine was taken out. Peter stood frozen, his eyes locked on the screen. It had worked. Again. But he knew this success wasn't the end. They were still at war, and the enemy wasn't going to stop. The ship was vulnerable, and every minute that passed was a countdown to another attack. But for now, Peter had done it, with nothing but a rusty bolt and a mechanic's ingenuity. He had bought the crew precious seconds, seconds that would turn the tide of the battle. The sonar was recalibrated, the weapons systems were working, and the convoy had a chance. Peter knew he had done his part. But as he stood in the engine room, watching the battle unfold, he couldn't help but wonder if his work would hold long enough to see them through the rest of the fight. The sea roared in fury as the convoy continued to advance, with Peter's ship now firmly in the midst of an escalating battle. The air was thick with smoke from the burning wreckage of enemy submarines, and the waves churned violently beneath the hull. Peter could feel the ship's vibrations through the floorboards as he made his way to the control panel once more. The initial success of the adjustments he had made to the sonar and weapon systems had bought them valuable time. But Peter knew this was just the beginning. With every attack, the ship grew more vulnerable. The bolts he had used to secure the sonar system were holding firm for now, but they were far from permanent solutions. The ship's systems were under constant strain, and the enemy was relentless. Peter knew that each moment the ship remained in the line of fire, the risk of catastrophic failure grew. A third enemy submarine emerged on the radar, its presence marked by the familiar blip on the sonar screen. Peter's heart raced. They had to fire again, but the systems were already beginning to show signs of stress. The engine was running hot, and the weapon systems were starting to lag behind. The once clear sonar readings were now flickering, and Peter knew that the enemy was adapting to their tactics. Peter gripped the wrench in his hand, eyes darting back and forth between the control panel and the radar screen. He could hear the men around him shouting orders, their voices tinged with panic. He didn't have time to think, only to act. His hands moved mechanically as he made another quick adjustment, bypassing a damaged relay to keep the sonar systems running. Every bolt, every wire, every connection had to be just right. The first torpedo was fired. The explosion on impact sent a shudder through the ship, but the submarine was still intact. It had taken the full brunt of their attack, but it hadn't gone down. The crew's cheers died quickly, replaced by the realization that the battle was far from won. Peter stepped back, watching the systems light up, then flicker out. The repairs were holding, barely. His mind raced as he considered his next move. The pressure on the ship's systems was mounting, but Peter knew that with one last push, he could give them the upper hand. The rusty bolt he had used to reconnect the sonar was still in place, but it was becoming less effective with every passing second. More adjustments, Peter muttered to himself, scrambling to find the right tools. There was no time for perfection, only survival. As Peter tightened the final bolt and made a critical adjustment to the weapon system, he could feel the heat rising from the engine room. The air was thick with the scent of burning oil, and the constant vibrations from the ship's stressed machinery reverberated through the floor. Sweat stung his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly from fatigue. The systems had been pushed to their absolute limits, but the last adjustment he made had stabilized the weapons long enough for the crew to take another shot. The next few minutes felt like hours. The ship groaned and shuddered as it moved through the water. The sonar was functional, at least for now. The enemy submarine was closing in fast, but they had one last chance to destroy it. Peter stood in the engine room, his mind racing. The ship was barely holding together. The bolts he had tightened, the wires he had rerouted, had kept them alive, but Peter knew this was a temporary fix. The submarine was too close. The weapon systems were firing, but there was a terrifying lag. The crew was firing blindly, but the shots were no longer on target. The torpedo was launched, but something went wrong. The explosion that should have obliterated the submarine missed by yards. Panic rippled through the crew, and the sounds of frantic shouting and scrambling filled the control room. Peter could hear the noise of enemy fire getting closer. "Come on, come on," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. His heart raced as he looked over at the torpedo system. Every system, every function seemed to be failing all at once. The bolts that had held the sonar in place were now creaking under the pressure. The engine was screaming for relief, and the ship groaned in agony as the hull began to strain from the pressure of constant attack. Another torpedo was fired. This time, Peter held his breath. It had to hit. There was no room for error. He closed his eyes for a moment, willing everything to come together. Seconds passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The blast of the explosion was deafening. Peter opened his eyes, and for a split second, everything was still. Then the whole ship shuddered violently. Peter was thrown to the ground as a massive explosion erupted just outside the hull. The ship rocked, and the lights flickered as the crew was thrown into total darkness. Panic filled the air, and the radio crackled with desperate calls for help. Peter's head spun as he tried to get back to his feet. The ship was sinking. The explosion had ruptured the hull, and water was flooding in at an alarming rate. The rest of the crew was scrambling to abandon ship. Peter's mind raced. He had done everything he could, more than anyone had expected from him. But now, with everything collapsing around him, he realized there was no guarantee they were going to survive this. The water rose quickly, and Peter felt the ship sinking beneath him. In the chaos, he spotted a lifeboat floating near the deck. He could hear the cries of the crew, but it was unclear whether anyone could make it out alive. Through the rising water, Peter made his way to the lifeboat, dragging himself over debris and bodies that were blocking his path. The crew had been able to take down 47 submarines and prevent the loss of countless lives. But at what cost? Peter had played his part, but as the water surged around him, he wasn't sure if he would survive to see another day. The final explosion rocked the ship, sending Peter into the cold, dark sea. As he sank beneath the waves, he realized there was no turning back. His moment of glory, the innovative, mechanical adjustments, had helped to protect the crew. But in the end, the battle was lost. The scene ended with Peter's face disappearing beneath the water's surface, leaving everything uncertain. The story of Peter Thomason's incredible mechanical feats spread quickly throughout the Navy after the battle. Despite the sinking of the ship, the crew survived, and Peter's quick thinking and engineering skills were celebrated across the armed forces. He had changed the course of the battle, saving hundreds of lives and preventing the destruction of vital supplies. But his legacy didn't end there. While Peter never sought fame or recognition, the impact of his actions would be felt for decades to come. His story inspired countless others to think outside the box and find simple solutions to complex problems in the heat of battle. Peter Thomason, the mechanic who saved the day with nothing more than a rusty bolt, became a symbol of ingenuity and resilience in the face of adversity. Thank you for joining us in this gripping retelling of an unsung hero's story. If you found Peter's story as remarkable as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell for more incredible, untold stories from history. New videos are released daily, each one packed with astonishing true events that will leave you in awe.